Well, good afternoon, everybody. We were just waiting for a moment or two to let people arrive, and I think we've got one or two still coming in, but at a much slower rate. We're past the main rush. It's very good indeed to welcome all of you virtually to this Francis Taylor Building webinar. I can't say to welcome you to Francis Taylor Building, but to welcome you to virtual FTB. And that's quite an appropriate way in which to be welcoming everyone today, since our topic this afternoon is planning for data and storage. And from the breadth and spread of people who have signed up to be with us this afternoon, it appears clear that we've hit a topic of interest, which people are encountering. And so I very much hope that what we're going to say this afternoon is helpful and stimulating in terms of thoughts and questions. If you've got questions, put them in the chat, and we will endeavour to deal with those at the end of the session. If just a few words about ourselves now. I'm Morag Ellis. I'm a QC in practice at Francis Taylor Building, dealing with planning and environmental law matters in many different fields, spanning both Town and Country Planning Act type of planning and infrastructure planning under the Planning Act 08, and also active in Welsh planning. And with me today, fellow speaker, is Michael Brett, who is one of our junior counsel from Chambers. He has a wide planning practice, including, again, working on several major nationally significant infrastructure projects. And dealing in a virtual way, as most of us are at the moment, with various different forms of inquiry and hearing and court appearances. I mentioned the chat function and the opportunity to ask questions earlier on. Please feel free to use that. Clearly, we're speaking in general terms today, and we can't be answering questions on specific cases, not least because we don't know all the facts of your specific cases, and we would hate to go and give a misleading answer through not knowing the full circumstances. And if I sound like a lawyer, that's probably because I am one. Now, Michael and I are going to share duties this afternoon. We've got a paper which we will deliver, and that will be available in electronic form afterwards, should you wish to have that. If so, please just contact Deirdre Mann at FTB Marketing, who sent you the details for this afternoon's seminar, webinar in the first place. So if you'd like the paper, do let Deirdre know, and she will send that to you electronically afterwards. And so that you don't have to look at just a single enormous talking face during the presentation, we've got a few slides to put up as we go along. I say we, but Michael is going to be putting the slides up as we go along, because I'm not as good at screen sharing as I would like to be. And we'll share up the spoken material between us. I'm going to kick off under the heading of what are data centres and why are they important? And I know that many of you here this afternoon will already have your own answers to those two questions, but they're still worth asking and offering some answers to kick off discussion and consideration this afternoon. Well, essentially, data centres are warehouses that provide the physical space and supporting environment required to house large quantities of computing equipment, primarily servers, along with associated components such as telecoms, network and storage systems. They constitute an important part of the essential data infrastructure underpinning the modern economy by transmitting, receiving, processing, storing, and managing digital data. And the government recognised that fact last year by including people who are employed in data infrastructure among the list of key workers near the start of the first national lockdown nearly a year ago now. There are about 400 to 450 data centre facilities in the UK, although it is a rapidly expanding form of development. And they operate on three principal models. Enterprise data centres are essentially large off-site IT rooms, if you like, for individual particular organisations. Then secondly, there are co-location data centres which provide secure service data centre space to a number of different organisations who rent the space in order to locate their own servers. And lastly, cloud service providers who will often run their own data centres to provide an entire package of IT services, infrastructure, IT platforms and applications for a customer organisation on the operator's own infrastructure. Now, as we all know, COVID has resulted in a sharp increase in demand for digital communications in many, many ways to enable business continuity through the pandemic. That's why we're meeting in this way virtually today, whereas this time last year, we would have set up, I'm sure, a conventional FTB seminar in Chambers or at some other central London venue. But even before lockdown struck 11 months ago, demand for data centre services was in any event booming. It increased by more than 500% in the years between 2010 and 2018. Unsurprisingly, UK-wide, thinking about UK government for the moment, and I know that we've got one or two Welsh people joining us today from Welsh local authorities, and I'll come to Wales a little later on. But looking at the UK government agenda at the moment, data centres and data storage is clearly key to several strands of policy, but they are rarely dealt with expressly or, as if you like, on their own terms. The government's industrial strategy identifies four grand challenges, as it calls them, and one of those is to put the UK at the forefront of the artificial intelligence and data revolution. Now, this is the Minister of Tech. Sorry, could we? Yes, we'll stick with the Right Honourable Oliver Dowden there, who is MP for Hertsmere, and he is now a digital secretary, as he says there in his quote, because we now have the Department for Digital Media, Culture and Sport. And there he is setting out his personal agenda there. Clearly, data centres, data storage underpins many, many different aspects of government activity and policy, hence the grand challenge. There is also a much more recent document, a draft national data strategy, which is a product of this government rather than the Theresa May government, which was the one that came up with the grand challenges. And this draft strategy has a number of pillars of effective data use, which are illustrated there in the yellow at the bottom: foundation, skills, availability, responsibility. Those pillars or themes run through the document, and then it, as it were, goes upwards on this on this graphic into a number of missions. And mission number 4 there is ensuring the security and resilience of data infrastructure. The government comments as follows: with data now a critical part of modern life, we need to ensure the infrastructure underpinning it is safe, secure and resilient. And the infrastructure on which data relies is a national asset, a vital national asset, supports our economy, delivers public services, drives growth. We need to protect it appropriately from security risks and other potential service disruption. So much, you might think, so obvious. The national strategy goes on to recognise that the need to store and process data will become even more critical, and they then provide some facts and figures to back that up. Where we next need to ask, does all that leave us in planning terms? We'll be coming on to see how the planning system treats data storage in a few moments. But to set the scene, I'm now going to hand over to Michael to outline some of the essential features in planning terms. Michael, thank you.
Thank you, Morag, and good afternoon. So when we think about any form of development, it's important to look at it going from that high policy position down to a more focused and practical understanding of the particular features of a form of development and how those features might drive their spatial distribution, their land needs, and indeed their principal impact in planning terms. So I'm going to take each of those in turn. So firstly, if we think about the location and the distribution of data centers across the country in spatial terms, there seem to be 3 principal considerations at play. And firstly, and perhaps most importantly, data centers need to be able to access appropriate energy infrastructure. The 24-hour operations of data centers consume a very large amount of energy, and that has to be delivered in as reliable a manner as possible. And we note the national data strategy's costs on resilience and security. One key element to that resilience and security will be the reliability of electricity supply. Whilst, by way of contrast, whilst a regular warehouse for normal B8 activities might have a supply of maybe 2 megavolt amperes, data centers require many times that. For example, a recently consented data center in Broxbourne required a total of 120 megavolt amperes. So the orders of magnitude in terms of energy required is notable. Proximity to appropriate national grid infrastructure, which allows connection straight into the grid and allows bypassing of local energy power networks, is therefore very important. This both avoids overburdening local networks which are used by other businesses and domestically, but also avoids potential fluctuations in supply that might come up with that shared power supply. Moreover, it might be desirable for a data center, a particularly large one, to have multiple different connection points to the grid which are independent of each other, and that will in turn increase resilience. And finally, there needs to be space on site for on-site substations, frequently if you're dealing with a large amount of energy. So that's the first key consideration in spatial terms. Secondly, data centers need to be located so that they have easy connectivity with clients and to internet exchanges by fiber optic cable. And so physical proximity to key clients or location within areas with high levels of fiber optic infrastructure is important, and this may limit the range of sites which are practicable for data center developments. And then finally, a key thing to avoid, having dealt with two key things to look for, a key thing to avoid, perhaps flood risk is high up on the list, it being a high concern to data centers, water damage, and water and electricity famously not mixing well. Water damage can have a devastating impact on the operation of a data center, and so location away from areas of flood risk is very important. So those are the three considerations that, in my view, seem to drive the spatial distribution and the desirability of land in particular places for data center use. One aspect, and moving on then, one aspect that the National Data Strategy picks up on is the need for good security at data center sites, and given their economic importance, the value of the machinery and the plant situated on them, and also the value of the data and the value that the economy attaches to the uninterrupted flow of data. And this has some consequences for the formal development as well. All sites, or the vast majority of sites, will require security apparatus, such as boundary treatments, multiple lines of fencing or high fencing or walls, 24-hour lighting, cameras, and entry and exit controls. And this will affect the built form of development and the way in which it sits within its context. Furthermore, when we look at aspects that might impact or might affect the impacts of data center development, we need to think about the fact that they operate 24 hours a day, with staff generally present at all hours. And this means that there will be a steady stream of traffic generation to and from the site and activity on the site, although this may be potentially more limited than other B8 or B-class generally forms of development. It's also necessary to keep internal environments regulated, whether hot or cold, they have to be at a constant temperature, and therefore noise impacts could arise from that cooling apparatus. But finally, the need, as we've spoken about, for secure power supply means that provision needs to be made at data centers for backup power generation in the event of grid failure or supply failure. And given the electricity consumption of these sites, this backup energy generation is often very sizable. At the DIGCOP B site, where a data development is coming forward, a provision is made there for 36 generators, each producing 2.64 megawatts of power for each of the two data hall buildings to be constructed. And that gives a huge export capacity of potentially over 200 megawatts. And now we're going to turn to see how these particular aspects of this formal development fit into the planning system. So back to you, Morag.
Thanks very much, Michael. Yeah, starting off then with use classes. Data center use, as maybe now becoming clear from what Michael's introduced and from your own knowledge, doesn't really sit comfortably in any particular use class under the order. The inspector in the Magna Park appeal decision, which is now quite old, 2009, understood a data center to be principally concerned with the storage of electronic data. And it followed from that that although data storage may be, as he then put it, a relatively novel form of storage, it is nevertheless storage. And so he held that data center use falls into class B8. By the way, that was a lawful development certificate case, and the inspector was a solicitor inspector, so one of the relatively small band of legally qualified inspectors. And so he looked at it in a very thorough and careful way, according to recognized notions, if you like, of construing things like the use classes order. And his reasoning, which was strong and well expressed, has been directly relied on by many local planning authorities in order to reach the view that data centres fall within Class B8, and many subsequent planning decisions have taken that position for granted. However, more recently, Wychavon District Council have taken a more nuanced and perhaps interesting approach. The officer's report on a fairly recent application there rejected a simplistic inclusion within B8 in favour of a more detailed assessment of the different ways in which a data centre might operate, which Michael and I have outlined above, as well as the physical conditions of the site and the characteristics of the particular proposed building. And his assessment was a data centre could arguably fall within B1, B8 or sui generis, and depends on the specific nature of the use proposed. Cases where data relates to storage for cloud users could arguably be distinguished from off-site data center storage for a single firm, which would traditionally be in a B8 use. In the former, the operator of the data center performs a number of additional services for members of the public that go beyond simple storage of their data. They are keeping and allowing access to the data in such a way that it facilitates a number of activities for the client, such as remote multiple user access, and also maintenance and upgrading services. In this case, he said, the entrances to the building and the internal floor area will be elevated a metre above ground level, which is a significant determining factor. Given that no subsequent conventional storage or distribution use could operate from the proposed building, given those physical characteristics, he said that it would be unlikely to be able to work for conventional B8 storage and distribution. And therefore, he concluded that he and the council would treat it and ought to treat it as sui generis. Now, that is a novel approach, and it's one which arguably is open to the logical objection that you shouldn't be deciding about land use on the basis of the design and specifically the potential for reuse of a particular building. The attraction of falling back on B8 class is that it does fit comfortably into existing development plan policies that relate to the use of industrial estates and urban fringe employment areas. It may also enable data center developers to slot their projects into existing outline permissions for business parks or industrial estates at the reserve matters stage, using already consented B8 floor space rather than seeking full permissions. The disadvantages of the traditional B8 approach are that bespoke buildings may not, in practice, be reusable for any different kind of B8 use, as the officer there said. And more fundamentally, perhaps, given the particular practical requirements in terms of power in all cases and proximity to clients in many cases, it may be that conventional employment locations cannot offer the requisite features for at least some kinds of data center. And in such circumstances, developers may need to look outside conventional employment allocations in areas not normally regarded as compatible with employment uses. In the Broxbourne decision, which Michael has already referred to, permission was granted for a data centre up to 62,000 square metres, together with a mixed B-class business area on land which was at that stage designated as Green Belt, although it had been identified in the emerging development plan for release for general employment purposes. Substantial weight, unsurprisingly, was given to emerging policy, albeit that in order for officers to reach a conclusion to recommend approval, which was accepted, the council managed to negotiate multi-million pound financial contributions running to more than £12 million to other business initiatives in the locality because of the perception of relatively low job generation from the data centre use. I'm sure that the Greenbelt location also drove the bargaining power that the LPA found themselves in on that occasion. Overall, officers were able to conclude, and members accepted, that very special circumstances existed, and so a consent was resolved to be granted. But VSC, of course, is a notoriously difficult argument on which to succeed, and certainly doesn't provide the sort of clarity for business planning to which the draft national data strategy and Secretary of State Dowden say in the general policy documents that they aspire. Obviously, the existence of Greenbelt around the leading conurbations, London, Manchester is the second biggest conurbation for data center storage, Birmingham, it is all likely to exacerbate those kinds of planning uncertainty and difficulty. So the location of data center in B8 use is not entirely comfortable, and it's only necessitated by the fundamental inability of the UCO, by definition, to cater for every form of development, which is why we have a sui generis catch-all category. And secondly, the failure of the current order to incorporate more novel forms of essential business and data infrastructure, notwithstanding the modernisations to the order which were made last year. One would have thought that that would have been a golden opportunity to have grappled with this problem, but that didn't happen. And until the government provides guidance or amends the order to make provision for data centres, the Wychavon approach to assessing applicable use classes, where that's a relevant issue, is pragmatically preferable, possibly, to a blanket BH approach, even if it's not entirely logical. Nevertheless, I would suggest that the uncertainty is unfortunate and could helpfully be addressed by the government in further amendment to the use classes order, which, of course, because it's secondary legislation, they could do much more easily than making changes to primary legislation. I turn next to think about the other main regimes of planning, and that's planning for major infrastructure, NSIPs, and then also, in addition to NSIPs, in Wales, developments of national significance. In the context of significant electricity generating capacity being provided on site, which is required in all cases, and in the very large regional, sub-regional data centres is required in large quantity, a question which has arisen in some cases is as to the proper consenting mechanism. In the case of the Didcot-B centre, recently approved, generating capacity of more than 200 megawatts was provided for in the form of diesel-fueled generators. Section 31, taken together with sections 14 and 15 of the Planning Act 2008, requires the construction of a generating station with a capacity of more than 50 megawatts to obtain consent via DCO process under the 2008 Act, not the 1990 Act. In the Didcot-B report, the officer dealt with this point in the following way. He said, a development comprising a generating station with a capacity of more than 50 megawatts would be an NSIP and should be determined by the planning inspectorate, or ultimately the Secretary of State. In this case, the generators are ancillary plant associated with the main data center use to provide emergency electricity backup, e.g. If there's a power failure, rather than as an electricity generating station for general consumption. And so he decided that his council was the appropriate consenting body. Now, that is very much a common sense approach. Although the officer didn't mention it, his conclusion, I suggest and believe, also accords with case law. In the case of Gate against the Secretary of State for Transport, Mr. Justice Turner held in 2013 that to fall within an NSIP, a project must fall entirely within the relevant description within the 2008 Act. And he noted that the statutory phrase is consists of, not includes. And he also pointed out that a mixed jurisdiction approach would be very difficult to apply in practice. Where would you draw the line? He asked rhetorically. And in my view, that's a highly persuasive question as well. Interestingly, the same issue arose recently at the end of last year in an application that was determined by Newport City Council. Although the relevant alternative statutory scheme that was contending, if you like, wasn't the 2008 Act, but as a result of the latest arrangement under the Welsh devolution settlement of responsibility for energy, the alternative regime of consent was under the Planning Wales Act 2015 and regulations concerning developments of national significance. The applicants, having discussed the point at the request of the planning authority with Welsh Government, and having taken their own legal advice, although that was not disclosed on the public file, the officer came up with the following ingenious approach to finding that his authority did indeed have jurisdiction. He said this: the proposals don't amount to a DNS because it is not a single generating station. They provide power to different floors of the building, and it wouldn't connect to the national grid and separately wouldn't produce the energy that would exceed the regs. In addition, the purpose of the electricity to be generated is not to add to the national grid, but to back up the servers in the event of failure. In fact, I would suggest that there was no need to resort to that, if you like, salami slicing approach to each of the individual generators and each of the individual floors of the units that were being proposed, because the wording of the Welsh regulations mirrors that of the UK 2008 Act, and therefore the wording is identical to that which was ruled upon in the case of Gate, which I mentioned earlier. Incidentally, while touching on matters Welsh, Planning Policy Wales, like the NPPF, doesn't include express consideration of data centres, but it is, like NPPF, generally welcoming to technological innovation and increased connectivity within the Welsh statutory future generations framework.
I'm now going to turn to some of the environmental issues that are posed by this form of development. And turning first then to the issue of carbon emissions. Now, as we've rehearsed a number of times, data centers are intensive consumers of electricity, and it's been estimated the energy consumption of existing UK data centers approaches about 6 terawatt per hour per year. And in 2011, it was estimated that data centers accounted for about 3.9% of the UK's total carbon emissions. To put that in context, that's pretty close behind the whole aviation industry in the UK, which comes in at 4.2% of total carbon emissions. However, as a large consumer with a stable and predictable demand, data centers are also well placed to act as anchor customers for renewable energy. And some operators we've observed are trialing alternative technologies such as fuel cells and batteries. when coming up against the carbon emissions impacts of these types of development, local authorities have varied in their stance. In the Boxbourne decision, again, to refer to that again, it's a nice recent decision, the officer considered that there was a clear requirement in local and national policy for development to contribute towards reducing carbon emissions, and as such recommended the imposition of a condition that a scheme of carbon offsetting to achieve carbon neutrality for the development should be put in place prior to first occupation. Now, that's a pretty big ask for a large data center, and not least because as the officer recognised, the application of the London model of carbon offsetting to the data center in this case would require contributions in excess of £25 million. Now, it's a surprisingly large amount of money, perhaps. By contrast, in a recent decision in Sheffield, the officer there exhibited no concern about carbon emissions. However, as we suggest in this presentation more generally, when considered in a rounded way against sustainability objectives, it's likely to be able to articulate a positive case for environmental contributions which data centres can make, not only through focus on renewable sources of energy, but also through things like facilitating remote working, cutting the need for travel in general, although we haven't yet seen any models which attempt to do this in a scientific fashion. Finally, turning to the issue of fuel storage and potential contamination, with standby generators comes the need for a significant amount of fuel storage on site. And by way of example, by reference to the Didcot B data center, that permission makes provision for the storage of 1.72 million litres of diesel on the site at any one time. And this clearly poses some potential risk in terms of leaks and groundwater and aquifer pollution if those leaks happen. And reasonable planning conditions are likely to need to be put in place in order to mitigate against that risk. There may also be requirement for some consent under the Planning Hazardous Substances Act of 1990, and this will engage questions of the relationship of the development site, the data centre, to neighbouring land uses, and also, importantly, to the development plan itself.
Thank you, Michael. I'm now going to come on to think about policy. We've talked about it to some extent, but to think a little more about that. And indeed to suggest that there is at present a policy gap in relation to this form of development. Central UK government policy, general policy, as we've seen, is predicated upon there being adequate and high quality data centre capacity, and it's fully signed up to the importance of that. But it doesn't at the moment translate into specific planning policy or guidance. In some places, particularly London, there have been attempts to get to grips with data centres, and the published London plan, which of course at some point fairly soon we shall lose, does speak in policy 4.11 of encouraging a connected economy, and requires the mayor to facilitate the provision and delivery of the information and communications technology infrastructure that a modern and developing economy needs. And it talks about securing network connectivity across London, data centre capability, electricity power supplies, security, and resilience. And then the supporting text, sorry, does actually mention data centres. It points out that they benefit from proximity to the offices that they serve, while other centres can be located close to local and sustainable sources of energy. But they are there. There's a beginning of the recognition of locational constraints, particularly to do with reliable, sustainable and resilient electricity supplies. Um, uh, but it then finishes by saying that they will be appropriate uses in preferred industrial locations and industrial business parks. So it's very much along that B8 model, which we were looking at earlier. Now, even that degree of strategic policy wording hasn't made it into the intend to publish new London plan. There's the new logo that presumably we'll all be living with for a few more years with the new plan coming in. There is no strategic commitment to ensure data centre capacity as such. However, the relevance of that form of development is referred to elsewhere, and particularly it states in chapter 9 that warehouse-based data centres have emerged as a driver of industrial demand in London over recent years, and this will need to be taken into account when assessing demand for industrial land. And then it cross-refers to the core policies in the employment sector of the plan, which look at different types of employment designations, such as land for industry, etc., policy E4, SIL policy E5, and local SIS policy E6. And there is a recognition there of the demand which data centres are exerting on industrial land generally. And obviously that is part of a real upturn in demand for storage and distribution, a general trend, but also very much intensified by COVID. Some London boroughs have attempted to take into account data storage needs in their own assessments of needs for employment land. For example, the Tower Hamlets local plan to 2031 identifies Blackwall as a local employment location suitable for SMEs and data centres which support the needs of Canary Wharf and the City of London. But that's the only provision of the plan that refers to data centres, notwithstanding, as those words point out, its strategic proximity to real drivers of demand for data storage. Currently, therefore, data centres are coming through planning applications, if you like, speculatively one-off, and are dealt with through general development management policies, which doesn't seem very consistent with the general NPPF commitment to plan-led development. So I would suggest that there's a strong argument in favour of development plans making explicit provision for data centre developments by both criteria-based locational policies and, where appropriate, by means of allocation. We have not been able to find any such policies in emerging development plans, however, which in turn is perhaps a function of the apparent ignoring of the issue in central government planning policy. More generally, NPPF paragraph 8, the Sustainable Development Strands paragraphs, emphasises the economic objective as part of the Sustainable Development Principle, talking about building a strong, responsive and competitive economy, and so on. I'm sure many of you can recite that in your sleep. Also, data centres are increasingly instrumental, I would suggest, in relation to the social objective strand of sustainability, given their role in supporting essential services such as the NHS, central and local government, and the police, to name but a few. And during the pandemic, the dramatic increase in the use of internet technology to keep the economy functioning, as well as its role in maintaining morale, has been a very striking feature. And in the wake of COVID, society's need for data storage has grown commensurately. Certainly in my family, we've now had so many family quizzes, I'm sure they're stored somewhere in a cloud. But seriously, as noted above, the impact of data centres on policy objectives for moving to a low carbon economy is potentially more complex, as Michael has been saying, and therefore that's something which national policy should be actively engaging in on a fully informed footing and helping local planning authorities to make the links between carbon footprint and a relationship to facilitating low carbon lifestyle, and beginning to understand some sort of trade-off, if you like, there, in a way, much as we're seeing in terms of biodiversity offsetting, but some serious overarching strategic thought needs to be given to that to help people to formulate sensible policies. There is a general policy commitment in paragraph 20 dealing with strategic policy making in the framework, requiring policies of local plans to make sufficient provision for infrastructure for various things. The list goes on, but the nearest one to data centres might be said to be telecoms. Data storage is not actually mentioned as vital infrastructure, which it would seem to follow from everything that we've been thinking about for the last 40 minutes or so together, it ought to in the next edition of NPPF. The absence of recognising this is not joined up with what we're seeing in other arms of government being led by by Oliver Dowden, for example, and it seems to be lagging behind the times. The provisions about telecoms in the NPPF are really very much driven, I think, by their own statutory code, the Telecoms Code, and so, for example, the question of need isn't addressed. Paragraph 82 of the framework gets a little closer, but it's still pretty generic. It says planning policies and decisions should recognise and address specific locational requirements of different sectors, including making provision for clusters or networks of knowledge and data-driven creative or high-tech industries, and for storage and distribution. But again, it's all a bit remote, if you'll pardon the pun. It's not really grappling with the issue in upfront terms. Location, as we've noted above, is a crucial factor for data centres. And taking location and need together, therefore, I would say that there's a strong argument that policies specifically recognising and dealing with the data economy need to be introduced into plan making. Just as residential or commercial development often follows the contours of highway infrastructure, as it were, both driving the need and helping to fund and satisfy the need. So the digital economy is going to follow the data highways, which in some instances will coincide with actual highways, and the data infrastructure that it needs to function. And in line with the National Industrial Strategy, all of this is going to become even more important. I don't think that we've got any representatives from central government on our guest list today, but we've got a lot of people, not only from industry and from the private professional sectors engaged in planning. We've also got a lot of representatives of local planning authorities here. So I would really like to urge you and ask you to take back some of these thoughts to your authorities and be starting to raise the topic where people are looking at policy formulation, because it is important for all of us in this changing world in which we live. So I'm just going to hand over to Michael now with the final conclusion, and then we'll do our best to take any questions. Michael, thank you.
Thanks, Morag. So as we've seen, I hope, in the course of this brief presentation, data centres are like many relatively novel forms of development in rapidly developing markets. They fit awkwardly into planning law and policy, which is necessarily in some case, although perhaps undesirably, reactive to changes in use. The habitual classification of data centers as a B8 use is somewhat strained, we think, and it's our strong encouragement that local and national policy be used and developed to secure the provision of data centers in suitable locations. And we've seen some of the parameters that restrict the sorts of areas which are suitable for this use. So there's perhaps a limited resource and an identified or a potentially identifiable need. When located like this, strategically, they can act, we say, as centres for economic growth in the emerging digital economy, which is the object of one of the objects, at least, of the industrial strategy and of the national data strategy. And so with those thoughts, we will leave you and ask whether you have any questions. So if I just click through to the Q&A.
Yeah, we've had one question on the chat from Richard Ford at Pinsent Masons, and Richard, thank you very much. You're asking about the Broxbourne case, I think, and how the developer achieved the carbon offsetting in practice. I think, unless Michael tells me otherwise, that history does not relate. And this was one of the things which was going to go off to be thought about in the context of the Section 106 negotiations, which, as I say, even at committee report stage, the local authorities seemed to have managed to secure about £12.6 million worth of different forms of contribution. But Michael, I don't know whether you have any further update to relate on that.
I'm afraid not. No intel, Richard. Sorry about that. It's an interesting question, though, and I can see why it would be useful to have some insight in practical terms when advancing this sort of development to try and work out how to see these requirements coming. The carbon emissions point, Morag, seems to me to be a very changeable one between local planning authorities, and that might reflect political aspirations or pressures within individual authorities. Where you have a climate emergency declared on a local basis, you're probably more likely to find this sort of consideration than maybe in other local authorities.
Yeah. Thank you. And Richard's commented, yes, they'll see if they can find out. I think that 106, as it evolves, because it's a pretty recent case, this one, I think that 106 will be an interesting thing to watch, and clearly it should be going up on the planning portal for Broxbourne, and is certainly an interesting thing to watch. But I would also like to see some coherent national thought going into this, to recognise if you like, the pros as well as the cons of that data centers can bring to the carbon debate with issues like virtual travel and such. It seems to me that it's something that needs some serious thought given to it. Thank you. I think that, Richard, you were our only questioner, and we're now at 1 minute to 3. So I think all that remains for me to do is to thank all of you very much for attending and for your interest, and to let Deirdre know if you would like a copy of the paper, and look forward to seeing some or all of you at some point, either virtually, because of course we can't see you in the webinar format, either virtually or preferably in real life sometime soon. Goodbye.